Act 1. The Gathering Storm. Scene 1. The arrival of Emily. It was the kind of crisp autumn morning where the sky appeared to have been brushed with pale blue and faint streaks of white clouds. The faint scent of pine mixed with the earthy aroma of wet leaves. Emily stepped out of the car, her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had been here before, of course. Every few months, she and her husband, Ben, made the long drive from Toronto to visit his parents. But this time was different. This time, there was a baby on the way, and it was time to confront the inevitable. As Emily walked up to the door, her gaze fell on the familiar porch swing, where Ben's mother, Margaret, would often sit with a cup of tea. A soft pang of nervousness shot through her chest. Emily had never been good at fitting into this family, especially with her mother-in-law. Their relationship had always been strained, a complicated dance of subtle judgments and veiled criticism. The door swung open before she could knock, revealing Ben's father, Tom. A warm, fatherly smile creased his face, and he wrapped her in a gentle hug. "Emily, welcome." "It's been too long," he said, his voice a balm to her anxiety. "Hi, Tom," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. He stepped aside to let her in. "Your mom's in the kitchen, making her famous stew," Tom added. "And I'm sure Ben will be here in a minute." Margaret's presence could always be felt before she was seen, like a shadow that loomed over the house. It was no different now. Emily could already hear the faint clinking of dishes from the kitchen, followed by Margaret's sharp voice as she hummed to herself, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had always existed between them. When they entered the kitchen, Margaret was standing by the stove, stirring a large pot of stew. She looked up as Emily entered, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, look who's here," Margaret said in a tone that carried the weight of years of unspoken words. "You look, well, Emily. How's the city treating you?" Emily's mouth went dry. She forced a smile and nodded. "It's been great. Busy, you know. And Ben's been working a lot." Margaret's eyes flickered briefly to Emily's midsection. "I'm sure it's been hard for you to manage, being pregnant and all. Must be quite the adjustment." "I was in my prime when I had Ben, of course." She returned to stirring the stew, her voice dripping with a subtle insinuation of superiority. The comment hung in the air, heavy and stinging. Emily knew she couldn't win a battle of words with Margaret. So she said nothing, instead watching as the older woman added a pinch of salt and continued to stir the pot. Tom, sensing the discomfort, cleared his throat. "I'm sure you'll both enjoy the stew. It's one of Margaret's specialties. We've got a lot to catch up on." He flashed Emily a look, hoping to ease the tension that had already settled in the room. Scene 2. The conflict unfolds. The dinner table was a carefully orchestrated scene of polite conversation and forced smiles. Ben, who had just returned from his meeting, settled into his seat beside Emily, offering a soft kiss on the cheek. He looked around the table, trying to gauge the atmosphere. His father was asking Emily about her job, but Margaret's gaze was fixed on the bowl of stew in front of her, as if her world revolved entirely around the simmering dish. Emily could feel her mother-in-law's eyes on her, but she didn't dare meet them. So Margaret said after a long silence, "Have you thought about the baby's name yet?" "I know it's early, but it's never too early to think ahead, right?" She leaned forward, the faintest of smiles curling her lips. "It's so important to pick a good name, something that carries weight, you know. Something that fits the family." Emily stiffened. She had been dreading this moment. Every conversation with Margaret inevitably led to her opinions on how Emily should live her life, from what she wore to the way she raised her future children. And naming their baby was no exception. "We've been thinking about a few names," Emily said carefully. "But we haven't decided yet." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her voice was thick with subtle judgment. "Well, I hope you'll at least consider the family names. You know, Ben's grandmother's name was Margaret. It would be nice if you honored that." Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure. We haven't really discussed it yet, but we'll think about it. Ben's hand squeezed hers under the table, a silent reminder that they were in this together. Emily glanced at him, seeking comfort, but his face was unreadable, his gaze turned toward his mother. Of course, Margaret said with a tight smile. But just remember, Emily, family traditions are important. It's not just about what you and Ben like. It's about what the family expects. Emily's heart raced, the words cutting through her like a blade. She couldn't bring herself to speak, her throat constricting with a mix of frustration and helplessness. It wasn't just about the name, it was the implication that she wasn't truly part of the family. She had never been, not in Margaret's eyes. She had married into a legacy that she could never fully claim, and that was a bitter pill to swallow. Scene 3. A tipping point. Later that evening, as the dinner table was cleared and the family settled into the living room, Emily found herself alone with Margaret. Ben had gone upstairs to finish some work, and Tom was fiddling with the TV remote, lost in his own world. Margaret, however, remained seated by the window, her hands folded in her lap. "So, Emily," Margaret began, her voice cutting through the silence, "I've been thinking about the nursery. You know, I have so many ideas for it. You could use some of my old things. I have a lot of baby clothes that I've kept from when Ben was little. You wouldn't believe the treasures I have tucked away. I'm sure you'd appreciate having something like that." Emily's blood ran cold. She knew what was coming. "I really think it's better if we decide on the nursery ourselves," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "We want to do things our own way." Margaret's expression hardened, though her tone remained even. "I understand, of course. But don't forget, Emily, there's a right way to do things. Family is about tradition. If you want to raise this child properly, you'll need to learn to honor those traditions." Emily stood up, feeling the weight of the room press down on her. The walls, once familiar, now felt like they were closing in. She didn't belong here. Not in this house. Not in this family. "I don't need your approval, Margaret," Emily said, her voice trembling with anger. "I love Ben, and we are starting our own family. We will raise our child how we see fit." Margaret's face twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll learn, Emily. You'll learn that it's not just about what you want. It's about what's expected of you." Emily turned toward the door, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. She wasn't sure if she was angry at Margaret or at herself for allowing this dynamic to continue for so long. But one thing was certain, their relationship had reached a breaking point. As she stepped into the cool night air, Emily felt the weight of the decision she had just made. There was no going back now. Act 2. The cracks deepen. Scene 4. Margaret's past. The next morning, the house felt eerily quiet. The usual hum of activity was absent, and even the air seemed still, as though it held its breath. Emily sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly sipping her coffee. Ben had left early for work, and Tom had gone to run some errands. Margaret, as always, was the last to emerge from her morning routine. She had never been an early riser, a fact that Emily had quickly learned during the early days of their marriage. Margaret liked her solitude, her rituals, time to herself before the world awoke. When she finally entered the kitchen, Margaret moved slowly, as though savoring every step she took. Her face was soft, though a hint of something colder still lingered in her eyes. "Good morning," Margaret said, her voice oddly pleasant, as if trying to repair the tension from the night before. She moved to the stove, as though this place was the one space where she could maintain control. Emily didn't answer immediately. She simply stared into her coffee cup, trying to find the right words, the right approach. Her mind was still reeling from the conversation, the unresolved emotions swirling inside her. Margaret had always been a difficult woman to read, but this new, softer tone only added to the confusion. "I'm sorry about last night," Margaret said, her back turned, stirring the contents of a pan. "I know I can be overbearing, but I just want what's best for you, for Ben, for the baby." Emily's eyebrows furrowed. This wasn't the Margaret she knew, the woman who had always stood firm in her judgments. "I don't need you to dictate how we raise our child," Emily finally replied, the words coming out sharper than she had intended. Margaret didn't react at first, but the shift in her body language was palpable. She placed the spoon down and turned to face Emily, her eyes cold once again. "You think I'm trying to control you, don't you?" Margaret's voice was steady, but the layers of emotion within it were clear. "That's not it at all. What I'm doing is helping you, guiding you as I did with Ben." Emily sat straighter, a surge of anger rising within her. "I don't need guidance, Margaret. I don't need to live by your rules, your traditions. This is our family now, not just Ben's. I don't want to keep hearing about the way you did things." Margaret's face remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something old, something she couldn't quite hide. A flicker of vulnerability quickly buried beneath a mask of defiance. "You'll understand one day," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of experience. "I didn't want to be like this. But when Ben was born, I had to fight for my place. For what I believed was right. Your mother might have told you differently, but this world isn't as simple as you think. There are things you don't know about being a mother-in-law. About what happens when the next generation comes along." Emily blinked, startled by the shift in Margaret's tone. There was a rawness to her words now, something Emily had never heard before. Margaret had always been the epitome of control, of authority. To see her so vulnerable, so real, it unsettled Emily in ways she didn't fully understand. "What are you saying?" Emily asked, the frustration and confusion creeping into her voice. Margaret paused for a long moment, her eyes flickering to the window, where the early morning light spilled across the backyard. "I never had a mother who could guide me," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I had to figure things out on my own. And I made mistakes, too many to count. But when Ben was born, everything changed. I wasn't just a woman anymore. I was someone's mother. And I had to be perfect. I had to give him the life he deserved, even if it meant sacrificing parts of myself." Emily stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Margaret had always been the woman who demanded perfection, who placed her family above all else. To hear her admit her own failures, her own pain, it felt like a revelation. The walls that had always been so firmly in place between them began to crack. "I just don't want you to make the same mistakes I did," Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I want you to understand what's at stake. You can't take this lightly, Emily. You can't just go into this blindly." Emily's heart softened, but the resentment was still there. "I'm not blind," she said quietly. "I just don't need you to tell me what's best. I'll figure it out, just like you did." For a long moment, the two women just looked at each other. There was a heavy silence in the air, a chasm between them that felt impossible to cross. And yet, in that moment, Emily realized something. Margaret wasn't just trying to control her. She was trying to protect her. In her own twisted way, she was offering the only version of love she knew. Scene 5, the long walk home. The tension that had been building over the past few days finally came to a head when Emily and Margaret went for a walk in the nearby woods, just as they did every year when the leaves turned. It had started as a tradition of sorts, though Emily had always felt like a reluctant participant. Margaret would talk endlessly about her life and her family, and Emily would listen, trying to keep her distance. But this year felt different. Emily had begun to understand Margaret in ways she hadn't before, perhaps because the prospect of motherhood was finally bringing their lives into sharper focus. As the two of them walked along the well-worn path, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only noise that filled the air. Margaret stopped at a clearing, the trees stretching high above them. She turned to face Emily, her eyes searching her daughter-in-law's face. "Emily," she began, her voice low, "there's something I need to tell you. Something you might not want to hear." Emily's stomach churned. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated before continuing. "When Ben was young, I wasn't always kind to him," I was so focused on making him strong, making him perfect, that I forgot to be his mother. I pushed him too hard, in ways you'll never understand. And now, with you here, I see you struggling, trying to balance everything, and I can't help but see the same mistakes being made. Emily's breath caught in her throat. You mean, you regret how you raised Ben? Margaret's gaze softened, and for a moment, the fierce woman who had always stood her ground seemed to dissolve, replaced by someone much smaller, much more fragile. I regret the way I made him feel like he was never enough. Like nothing he did was good enough. And now I see you, trying to make your own way, and I realize something. You're not like me. You don't need to fight to prove your worth. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat, her own emotions rising to the surface. I don't want to make the same mistakes, Margaret. I want to be different. For my child. Margaret nodded, the briefest flicker of understanding passing between them. And you will be. I believe you will. Act 3. Shifting Foundations. Scene 6. A family's secret unveiled. The weeks passed, and the tension in the house seemed to simmer beneath the surface, always present but never fully boiling over. Emily had taken to avoiding Margaret when possible, though she was more willing to engage in short conversations. Ben, for his part, had noticed the strain but hadn't been sure how to address it without making things worse. He was caught between the woman he loved and the woman who had raised him, a delicate balance that felt increasingly impossible to maintain. One evening, as Emily sat in the living room flipping through a pregnancy book, she overheard Margaret and Tom talking quietly in the kitchen. Normally, Emily wouldn't eavesdrop, but the mention of Ben's name caught her attention. I'm worried about Emily, Margaret's voice carried clearly through the walls. She's going to make the same mistakes I did. Tom's voice was more measured, but there was an undercurrent of concern. I think she'll be fine. Ben and Emily have always been strong together. They'll figure it out. I'm not sure, Margaret replied, her tone heavier than usual. She doesn't know what it's like. She doesn't understand what I had to do to raise Ben. The pressure, the isolation. And there's something else, Tom. I've never told her about what happened when Ben was younger. The words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She set the book down, heart pounding in her chest as she leaned closer to the door. What had happened to Ben? What was Margaret hiding? Tom's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret, you don't need to dredge up those old memories. It's in the past. But Margaret didn't seem ready to let go. Ben doesn't know either. He doesn't know what I did. What I had to do. And I don't want Emily to repeat my mistakes. I don't want her to feel as alone as I did. As I still do. Emily's mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but leaving behind more questions than answers. She had never fully understood Margaret's obsession with control, her fixation on perfecting every detail of Ben's life. And now she was beginning to realize that perhaps there was more to the story. Much more. Scene 7. The Confrontation. Later that evening, Emily couldn't shake the conversation she had overheard. The weight of Margaret's words hung heavy in the air. Her curiosity and unease had reached their peak. She knew she had to confront her mother-in-law. She had to understand the truth, what had happened in Ben's childhood that Margaret was so afraid to share. Ben was in the other room, engrossed in his work. Emily walked up to Margaret, who was seated by the window again, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as though she could distract herself from the thoughts weighing on her mind. Margaret, Emily began, her voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. I heard you and Tom talking earlier. About Ben. About what happened when he was younger. Margaret's hand froze in midair, the knitting needles clattering to the table. She didn't look at Emily immediately but instead gazed out the window, her expression unreadable. Margaret started, but she trailed off, her words faltering as if she hadn't expected to be caught. Please, Margaret. I need to know what you were talking about, Emily pressed. What happened to Ben? Why do you feel like he, like you, are so broken? You've always treated him like he was some kind of project to fix. Like he couldn't be good enough for you. Margaret's eyes finally met Emily's, but there was no anger in them, only exhaustion. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never wanted to hurt him, Emily. You have to believe that. I was trying to make him strong. Stronger than I was, stronger than his father was." Emily felt her throat tighten. "What do you mean? What happened to him, Margaret?" Margaret sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world was too much for her to carry any longer. "Ben was only 5 when I had to send him away for a time. I didn't want to, but things were falling apart. I had to focus on keeping our family together. I had to make decisions that a mother should never have to make." The words felt like a punch to Emily's gut. "Send him away?" she repeated, her voice shaking. Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. There were threats from his biological father's family. They were dangerous people. I didn't have the means to protect him, not the way I should have. So I sent him away to live with my sister for a few months. I thought it was the safest thing to do. I thought I was doing the right thing." Emily stood there, stunned. "Ben never knew? He never knew you sent him away?" Margaret's voice cracked. "No. I told him I was sending him to boarding school. It was the only way I could protect him without worrying about what they might do. He was so young, so vulnerable. But the guilt. I've carried it with me every day since then. And now, when I see you and Ben trying to make your own family, I can't help but want to shield you both. I don't want you to face the same loneliness I did." Emily was silent, her mind reeling. The pieces were finally falling into place, but they didn't make things clearer, they only made them more complicated. "I never knew," Emily whispered. "I never understood why you were so controlling, so overbearing. I thought it was just about family traditions, about keeping everything in line. But now I see it's more than that. You've been trying to protect Ben, haven't you? All this time. From your own mistakes." Margaret nodded slowly. "I thought I could keep him safe. But in doing so, I may have hurt him more than I ever realized." Scene 8. The long road ahead. As Emily sat down next to Margaret, a heavy silence filled the room. The revelation had shaken both of them to their core, but it also opened a door, a chance for reconciliation, even if it was still a long road ahead. "Margaret," Emily said softly, "you did what you thought was best. I can't say I agree with everything you did, but I understand now why you made those choices." Margaret wiped a tear from her eye and gave Emily a small, sad smile. "I never wanted to be this way, Emily. I just didn't know how to protect Ben any other way. I didn't know how to be a mother without being so controlling." Emily took Margaret's hand, offering a small but genuine gesture of empathy. "I can't change the past, and I don't want to. But we can start fresh. We can move forward from here." Margaret nodded, her grip on Emily's hand tightening, a silent promise between them that things could get better. Act 4. The Ties That Bind. Scene 9. Ben's reaction. It was late that evening when Ben finally came home from work, his briefcase in hand and a tired expression on his face. He greeted Emily with a soft kiss on the cheek, sensing immediately that something had shifted in the atmosphere. The house, which had felt stiff and strained for weeks, now seemed quieter, almost expectant. "Hey," he said, setting his things down by the door. "What's going on? You two seem different tonight." Emily and Margaret exchanged a glance, both women silently acknowledging the shift between them. The weight of the day, the conversations, the shared moments hung between them like a bridge, fragile yet real. Margaret had yet to speak of their conversation in full, but Emily could tell that she was ready to let the past go, to stop guarding it so fiercely. Margaret, who had been sitting in the living room with her knitting, looked up at Ben. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a quiet strength in them. She knew the time had come to share everything. "Ben," she began, her voice softer than usual, "there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Ben froze, his hand still on the doorframe. His father, Tom, had always mentioned how quiet Margaret could get when she was nervous, but this was different. There was an openness in her that he hadn't seen before. "Mom?" he asked, concern flickering in his eyes. Margaret stood slowly, the weight of her decision clearly visible. "It's about when you were younger. About what I had to do to protect you. To keep you safe." Ben blinked, confusion sweeping over his features. "What do you mean, Mom? What are you talking about?" Margaret hesitated. The last thing she had wanted to do was burden her son with this, but now she knew it couldn't be avoided. "Ben, I sent you away when you were 5. I didn't want to, but I had to. There were things going on in the family, things that were dangerous. I couldn't keep you here. Not with what was happening." Ben's face went pale, and his mind spun, struggling to process the words. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out at first. The pieces of his childhood, the gaps, the years he had never fully understood, began to fall into place. "You sent me away," he finally managed to ask, his voice strained. Margaret nodded, her own eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I never told you because I didn't want you to feel abandoned. But it was the hardest decision of my life. I thought I was doing what was best for you." Emily stood in the background, her heart aching for Ben. She had heard Margaret's side of the story, and while it didn't excuse everything, she could now see why Margaret had been the way she was. It was out of a deep love, but one twisted by fear and guilt. Ben ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside him. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" he asked, the hurt evident in his voice. "Why keep it a secret?" "I would have understood. I would have." His voice trailed off. "I didn't want you to hate me," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to think I was a bad mother. But I never knew how to tell you. And now, seeing you and Emily, seeing how you're about to start your own family, I can't keep hiding it." Ben took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of everything. He didn't know how to process this revelation. His whole childhood, his whole understanding of his relationship with Margaret, had just been shattered. Emily moved toward him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Ben, I know this is a lot, but your mom did what she thought was best. It was out of love, even if it was the wrong choice." Ben's eyes flickered between his wife and his mother, torn between the two women who meant the most to him. For a moment, the room felt suffocating, the silence thick with unspoken words. Finally, he let out a deep breath and looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. "I don't know what to say, Mom," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to feel." Margaret reached out to him, her hands trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Ben. I just wanted you to know the truth." Ben's heart felt heavy. The weight of Margaret's secret was like a burden he hadn't known he was carrying, and now the air between them was thick with everything unsaid. Scene 10, the turning point. Over the next few days, things at the house remained awkward. There was no way to simply brush off what had been revealed. Ben spent hours in silence, processing the truth about his childhood and the woman who had raised him. Margaret, for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel vulnerable, knowing that the shield she had built around herself had been cracked wide open. And Emily, though she tried to be the bridge between the two of them, felt a deep sense of loss for the mother-in-law she thought she understood. One evening, after dinner, Ben pulled Emily aside into their bedroom. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I can't just pretend like everything's fine with Mom. I don't know how to get past this, Emily." Emily sat beside him, her hand resting on his. "I know, Ben. It's a lot to take in. But you don't have to get past it right away. We'll figure it out. Together." Ben's eyes softened as he looked at her, but there was still a hesitation there, a reluctance to forgive, to let go of the anger that had built up over the years. "She hurt me, Emily. And I'm not sure how to forgive that." Emily took a deep breath. "I think it's going to take time. But you can't carry this around forever. Neither of you can." Ben looked at her, his gaze searching. I don't know how to go back to how things were. To the way we were before." Emily squeezed his hand, offering him a gentle smile. You don't have to go back, Ben. You can move forward. It'll be a new kind of relationship. It won't be perfect, but it doesn't have to be. Ben nodded, though there was still a part of him that wasn't sure. He knew that this was going to be a long, difficult journey. But as he looked at Emily, the woman who had always been his anchor, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe they could rebuild. Maybe they could move forward after all. Scene 11. Margaret's apology. The following week, after some time had passed, Margaret approached Ben once again. This time, there was no defensiveness, no barrier between them. She simply stood in the doorway of his office, looking at him with open eyes, as if waiting for him to decide what came next. Then, she said quietly, "I know I can't undo the past. I can't take back the decisions I made, the things I kept from you. But I can promise you this, I will never hide anything from you again. I'll never try to protect you from the truth again." Ben, still processing his emotions, took a deep breath. He looked at his mother, who had always been a figure of strength, but now seemed so much more fragile. "I don't know what to say, Mom," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now. But I hear you. And that's a start." Margaret nodded, the tears finally falling from her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I hope someday we can find a way to heal. I'll be here whenever you're ready." Ben looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him. Slowly, he stood up, walking over to her. He didn't have all the answers, and there was no quick fix for the wounds of the past, but for the first time in years, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could heal. He pulled Margaret into a hug, and though it wasn't perfect, it was a step forward. Act 5. The future unfolds. Scene 12. A family rebuilt. The days following the confrontation had been a whirlwind of quiet introspection and tentative steps toward healing. The tension between Ben and his mother, Margaret, hadn't vanished overnight, but there was a new kind of understanding between them. They were no longer bound by old secrets or unspoken resentments. Instead, there was a fragile hope that, with time, things could improve. Emily watched as Ben began to engage more with his mother. Their conversations were still strained, but there was less avoidance now and more willingness to confront the past. It wasn't easy, but the small moments of connection, Ben sitting with Margaret in the kitchen as she prepared dinner, laughing at a shared memory, began to heal the wounds that had long festered. One afternoon, as the leaves began to turn their fiery red and gold hues, Emily stood by the window, her hand resting on her growing belly. Ben joined her, his presence a quiet comfort. "It's crazy," Emily said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. "All the things that have come out, all the things that have been said. I thought I was going to lose you, both of you. But now," Ben wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Now we're finding a new way. Maybe it's not perfect, but it's real. It's better than pretending it doesn't matter." Emily smiled, a sense of peace washing over her. "I've always believed families can heal, even when it feels like the cracks are too big." He kissed the top of her head. "I think you're right. We have a long road ahead, but we're not alone anymore." Scene 13. A mother's blessing. The evening was cool, the kind of evening that made people gather together in warm spaces. The house felt different now, more open, more inviting. Emily and Ben had invited Margaret to join them for a quiet dinner, the three of them, along with Tom, sitting around the table. It was a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but there was something profound about this moment. It was the first time in years that Emily felt like a genuine part of the family. Margaret wasn't the stern, distant figure she had once been. She was present, listening, her face soft, as though letting go of her defenses for the first time in a long while. As the evening drew on, Ben's father, Tom, excused himself, leaving Margaret and Emily alone in the dining room. There was a peaceful silence, the kind that wasn't heavy with tension, but filled with something lighter, more hopeful. Margaret looked over at Emily, her expression sincere. "I've been thinking a lot, Emily," she began, her voice steady but with an edge of vulnerability, "about everything that's happened. I know I've hurt you. I've pushed you away. I've made things difficult for you." Emily met her gaze, nodding slowly. "You didn't make things easy, but we've both learned a lot, and that's what matters now." Margaret smiled softly, a tear escaping her eye. "You're right, and I'm sorry for everything. I wasn't always the mother-in-law you deserved, and I can't change that. But what I can do is show you that I'm here, that I want to be here for you and for Ben." The sincerity in Margaret's words touched Emily deeply. She had always feared that this relationship would be a battle, one that couldn't be won. But now she saw the possibility for something different, something more tender, more patient. "I want that too, Margaret," Emily said quietly. "I want us to be able to be family without all the fear and doubt. I don't want us to keep repeating the same mistakes." Margaret nodded, her hands folded gently in front of her. "We won't. I promise." In that moment, Emily realized how much she had grown in the face of their challenges. She had confronted her fears, stood up for herself, and found the strength to forgive, not just for Ben's sake, but for her own. And Margaret, too, had begun to change. The walls that once stood so high between them were beginning to crumble. Scene 14, A New Beginning. As the weeks passed, the dynamic between the family members continued to evolve. The distance between Ben and Margaret remained, but it was no longer an insurmountable gulf. There were still moments of discomfort, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, but there were also new, hopeful moments. Margaret came to their home more often, offering to help with the baby preparations, not in an overbearing way, but with genuine care. Emily began to allow Margaret to be a part of things, slowly inviting her into the fold of their family, step by step. One chilly afternoon, Emily and Margaret stood in the baby's nursery, a small room in their home that had been transformed over the past few weeks. The walls were painted a soft green, and the crib had been assembled. They had worked together to choose the furniture and set up the room. There was a quiet peace in the air as they both looked around the space, the weight of the past no longer holding them back. "You know," Margaret said, her voice soft, "I always thought I would be the grandmother who told you how to do everything. Who told you what to name the baby, what to buy, how to raise him. But I've learned that's not my place. This is your family, Emily. And I'm just here to support you, to love you both." Emily turned to her, her eyes misty with emotion. "I know. And I think that's all we ever needed from each other. To be there. To love." Margaret smiled, her face glowing with a quiet pride. "I've always wanted what was best for you, for Ben. And now, for this little one, too. I know it won't be easy, but we'll be all right. We've got each other." Emily nodded, her heart full. "We do. And that's enough." Scene 15, The Birth of a New Chapter. The night the baby was born, it wasn't just a new chapter in Emily and Ben's life. It was a new chapter for the entire family. The labor was long, but when their son finally arrived, everything seemed to fall into place. Margaret was there, just as she had promised, her eyes filled with tears as she held her grandson for the first time. She was no longer just the mother-in-law, she was family. She was a grandmother. As Ben stood beside Emily, holding their son in his arms, he looked over at Margaret, who was gently cradling the baby. He saw the love in her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace between them. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Mom?" he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret looked up at him, a soft smile on her face. "We have. And I'm proud of the family we've become." "I'm proud of you, Ben." Emily leaned her head on Ben's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the moment. In that room, there was no room for past grievances or mistakes. There was only love, love for their son, for each other, and for the journey that had brought them to this moment. Epilogue. The future is ours. Months passed, and the family continued to grow, both in number and in emotional depth. Margaret visited often, her relationship with Emily now based on mutual respect and understanding. There were still moments when they disagreed, but they no longer carried the weight of the past. Ben, too, found a new sense of peace in his relationship with his mother. He no longer carried the burdens of resentment or anger. Instead, he focused on the future that they were all building together. And as for Emily, she learned that sometimes healing isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's messy, complicated, and full of setbacks. But with love and patience, it was always possible. Together, they faced the future, uncertain but hopeful. And that was enough.